Montana, autumn of 1887. The dry wind swept through silvered pines like the sigh of a land that had forgotten how to believe in anything new. The mountain train shrieked across the barren valley, trailing dust from places no one spoke of anymore. Elkhorn, once a bustling mining town, now stood with sagging roofs, rotting signboards, and glances accustomed to disappointment. At a platform covered in ash and coal, the train came to a grinding halt. The door creaked open. A woman stepped down. No one asked who she was. No one moved to greet her. But every eye turned. Watchful, silent, wary, she came from the east, carrying something this place did not recognize, the upright posture of someone who had never learned to bow, and eyes that refused to be swallowed. No one knew why she had chosen Elkhorn. And no one imagined that from the moment she stepped off that train, the town had already begun to change. It took only a single afternoon for word to spread across Elkhorn. A strange woman had arrived in town alone, unescorted, unclaimed. She didn't resemble the worn-out drifters from the mining camps. She wore a dark traveling coat, sturdy leather boots, and walked like someone who knew every stone beneath her feet. No one knew where she'd come from, but her voice marked her as educated, her movements as someone who'd tasted hunger. And most unsettling of all were her eyes that made folks feel seen, even when no words were spoken. She rented a narrow room above the blacksmith's shop, where the scent of iron clung to the curtains. Each morning she left early with her satchel, stopping by the general store, lingering long outside the crumbling medical shack where Dr. Albrecht had once treated miners and whores, back when the town still gave birth to silver. Slowly she began cleaning the place, wiping down the tables, honing the blades, lighting the stove, boiling things no one recognized. No one had hired her. No one had called her in. And yet she was there, staying longer each day, leaving later each night. A week later, when the clinic door finally opened at dawn, the town began to understand. She hadn't come to pass through. She was preparing to stay. Her name was Mary Whitaker, once a medical student in Boston, once a hospital intern, once praised for surgeon's hands, but also once denied a license for wearing skirts, once forced to watch her mother die from a botched operation, once forced to bury her kin with her own hands during the cholera season. These things she didn't tell anyone in Elkhorn, but they showed in the way she tied up her sleeves before cleaning a wound, in the way she looked at a fevered child without flinching. No one had taught her how to survive the West, but she was learning fast. The first man to let her touch him was a miner, his leg split open from a slipped axe. She stitched him with corn whiskey and a needle meant for burlap. He nearly passed out from the pain, but the wound didn't rot. The next morning, Dr. Albrecht handed her a ring of rusted keys and said, "If you know what you're doing, do it." In Elkhorn, that meant, "I won't stop you." Still, not everyone welcomed her presence. Men on the street squinted when she passed. Women whispered behind half-drawn curtains. Some said she was a discarded bride, others a fallen aristocrat. But they all agreed on one thing. She wasn't like them, and she wouldn't last. But Mary stayed, quietly, patiently. Sometimes she was seen riding by lantern light, or standing for long minutes beneath the eaves, watching the storm gather. She didn't preach, didn't explain, but every wound bandaged, every child's fever broken, every crooked finger set was a wordless way of saying she didn't need your approval to exist. Then one afternoon, with wind blowing strange from the north, a tall man on a black horse rode through Elkhorn. His eyes searched for nothing. But Mary, standing on the steps of the clinic, watched him pass for a very long time. He arrived on a low-cloud afternoon, when light slid across the mountains like a thin blade. No one knew who he was. No one saw him step off a train or ride into town. But when the dry wind rattled the tin bell above the general store, he was already there, tall, draped in a dust-covered coat, dark hair swept by the breeze, and a narrow scar cutting from cheekbone to jaw, just enough to make others look away. He didn't buy much. A few rolls of tobacco, some salt, a used knife, rough cloth, and 2 cans of beans. His voice was deep and gravelly, like stones being crushed underfoot. When he stepped out of the store, he didn't glance at anyone, only pulled his hat low and walked down the main road, like a man long used to silence. Mary Whitaker happened to be nearby, carrying a cloth bag of dried herbs she'd just bartered from the blacksmith's wife. She didn't notice him at first, but as he passed, not fast, not slow, their eyes met. There was no nod, no expression, but something lingered in that glance, as if for a flicker of a moment they each saw something unnamed in the other. That night, Elkhorn turned colder than usual. The wind slipped through every crack in every door. The clinic glowed faintly under a flickering lamp. Mary was sorting powders, separating sutures. Dr. Albrecht had long since gone to bed. Then came the knock. One short, one long. One short again. Not the rhythm of townsfolk. She opened the door, lamp in hand. There he stood, pressing his left hand over a blood-soaked shoulder. He didn't say much, just pulled back his coat, a deep tear in the fabric. Blood blooming slow like a flower. She tilted her head slightly, nodded once, and stepped aside. He sat on the bench. No groan, no question. No gratitude. Mary opened her kit, lit the alcohol lamp, boiled water. She worked in silence, hands steady, familiar with pain. When she pulled the bullet and began stitching, he only exhaled once, then still. No man in Elkhorn had ever endured like that. When it was done, she washed her hands, wiped the blood from the floor, and asked gently, "Your name?" He looked at her for a long time, then said low, "Call me Calvin." No last name. No origin, just a name that mattered to no one but him. Then he stood, slowly pulled on his coat, left a few coins beside the stained bandages, and walked out, no directions asked, no backward glance. By morning, word spread. A stranger had taken up shelter in the old shack near the northern cliffs. Some said he'd been a mercenary for the Southern Army. Others claimed he'd killed 6 men in Arizona over a card game. No one had proof. But everyone agreed on one thing. He was dangerous. Mary said nothing. But later, as she set her herbs to dry under the midday sun, she saw him, sitting on a distant boulder near the ridge, pipe in hand, eyes locked on the hills like he was searching for ghosts. She didn't wave. He didn't nod, but they saw each other. And somehow that was enough. In the days that followed, Elkhorn sank into a silence that didn't feel honest, the kind of quiet only towns that had heard gunfire at high noon could recognize. Mary moved as she always did, rising early, walking to the old clinic, dressing the blacksmith's burns, bringing down the fevers of sawmill children. But she began to notice the shift eyes that didn't just watch, but measured. Caution where there used to be mere curiosity. As if she'd crossed a line no one had ever spoken aloud, but all silently understood. Calvin was gone from view. No sightings at the store. No shadow along the main road. Not even his usual silhouette on the ridge. But Mary knew he hadn't left. Each morning, fresh boot prints appeared on her back steps. One day, a tight bundle of wild herbs, just the kind she'd run out of, was placed neatly on the clinic sill. No note, no signature. But at the base of one leaf, a diagonal cut, sharp and deliberate. For Mary, it was clearer than any spoken message. I know what you need. I'm watching. The town had started whispering. Those who once avoided her eyes now spoke plainly behind her back. Someone spat near her boots as she passed. A mother yanked her child's arm when Mary knelt to offer help. Fear began to replace doubt. And in Elkhorn, fear had always been kindling for men like Hal Cummings. Hal was still Hal Harsh jawline, voice like dry gravel. Since Mary turned down his offer, he hadn't looked her in the eye. But folks noticed he stayed longer in the saloon these days, murmuring to new faces. Men with southern drawls and sun-leathered hands that never seemed to rest on tables. Then one night, Mary heard low voices outside the clinic. She doused the lamp, stepped to the back quietly. In the dirt, 2 fresh sets of deep-heeled prints, the kind made by men who wore weight in their souls. By the back door, someone had drawn a crude black mark in charcoal, a circle slashed through with a single line. It was an old Western warning leave, before blood speaks for you. She didn't go to the sheriff. Mary understood the law in Elkhorn didn't sit on any badge, but in the hand fast enough to shoot, and still live to explain. Instead, she slid another board behind the back door, locked away her most valuable medicines in a tin box beneath the floorboards, and packed a few bandages in her satchel not to run, but to make sure she wouldn't die for nothing. A few days later, she saw Calvin again. Not coming in, not speaking. Just leaning against a pine behind the clinic as the dusk turned bronze. The fading sun touched his scar like a dull blade. She stepped onto the porch, didn't speak, but he nodded once, reached into his coat, and laid a folded scrap of paper on the steps. Then he turned and left. Mary unfolded it. Just a few lines, crooked handwriting but clear enough. They're talking about Saturday night. 6 men, real weapons. Not here to scare you? No name, just a single deliberate slash across the bottom like a knife had marked it. She read it, folded it again, and for the first time in months she felt her heart race. Not from fear, but because she knew this was no longer about her. It was about something bigger, something she'd promised herself the day she stepped off that train. If I don't stand, who will? By Friday morning, Elkhorn was no longer the same. No one spoke loudly. No one laughed too long. Even the dogs that usually barked lay silent beneath porches. Red dust clung thick to window panes. The church bell didn't ring. Mary felt it, not through sound, but the absence of it. The air seemed pulled tight, compressed. She rose before the sun, sealed every window of the clinic, reinforced the front doors with nails and rope. Her most vital medical tools were divided into 3 bags, one for trauma, one for bleeding, one with only morphine and clean cotton. She wasn't planning to flee, but she knew if the night came as warned, she had to be ready not to escape, but to survive without surrendering the things she refused to give up. As she packed, Calvin arrived. Not suddenly, not rushed. As if his entrance had been arranged with the stillness itself. He pushed the back door open with his shoulder, saying nothing, carrying a large cloth sack filled with coiled wire, rusted blades, and 2 oil-wrapped revolvers. Slung across his back was the rifle she now recognized, a Remington once issued to a scout unit spoken of only in late-night whiskey tales. "They'll come from the south," he said softly, like speaking too loud might break something fragile in the air. Mary nodded. She handed him a roll of barbed wire salvaged from an abandoned cattle yard. He began working, setting traps beneath the porch, burying stakes under dusted paths, stringing warning lines between trees along the side lot. No one spoke much, but each movement, each exchange, held the ease of 2 people who'd done this before, though they never had. By late afternoon, they stood on the wooden steps, watching the sun sink into the mountains. Mary wiped her hands with an old rag and asked, "What if they don't come?" Calvin didn't look at her. His eyes stayed on the red smear sliding down the ridgeline. "Then we pull the traps tomorrow. Better that than regret what we ignored." Mary said nothing more, but in her eyes, there was no doubt, only a calm resolve that felt louder than fear. Her life, her presence, her refusal to bow would not end quietly. Night fell, no moon, no stars. Mary cooked a simple stew from dry meat and root vegetables. Calvin sat across the table, back always to the door, as if by instinct. He ate slow, eyes watching the dark behind her. When the last bowl was cleared, he spoke, voice rough as old rope. "There was another woman once. Somewhere else. I tried to protect her. Didn't make it." Mary didn't ask more. She simply laid her hand on his. His palm was coarse, colder than the night air. But this time he didn't pull away. Outside, wind scraped the roof. Smoke drifted faintly through the cracks. Mary stepped onto the porch. On the far southern ridge, a thin gray line rose against the dusk-burnt brush, or something more. She stared at the horizon, her spine as straight as it was the day she arrived in Elkhorn. Inside, Calvin was checking rounds, each bullet wiped clean, rolled in his fingers once, then loaded with quiet finality. When Mary came back inside, she said only one thing. "They want me afraid. They want you gone." Calvin looked at her. "Then let's give them something to remember." They came at high noon on Saturday, no warnings, no signals, only the pounding of hooves echoing down the street like war drums, and a cloud of red dust rising from the southern edge of town, like smoke behind a fuse. Calvin had been standing on the clinic's porch since dawn, rifle slung across his shoulder, gloved hands steady. Inside, Mary checked her medical packs one last time, uncorked a bottle of morphine, and wrote down the names of everyone she'd ever treated in Elkhorn into a small leather notebook. Not for protection, but so she wouldn't forget, should the worst come. When they appeared at the far end of Main Street, the townsfolk of Elkhorn vanished behind curtains. Windows shut, doors locked, children dragged inside like hens before a storm. No one shouted. No one intervened. At the front rode Hal Cummings, astride a gray horse, black wool coat flapping behind him like a battle flag. His face burned red with old anger, his eyes stripped down to spite. Behind him were 5 men, 2 hired guns, a former mercenary from Wyoming, a disgraced trapper from Idaho, and one brute known only by the damage he caused. Mary stepped out onto the porch, not carrying a gun, only her presence. She didn't shake. Didn't back away. Wind pulled strands of hair across her cheek. A fresh bruise still bloomed on her arm, but her eyes burned like low, steady flame. Calvin stood beside her, rifle loaded, finger resting loose near the trigger. He didn't look at the gang. He watched the dirt measuring the exact spot where a wrong step would land. Hal reined his horse in, spitting into the dust before growling, 10 seconds to leave my town. You and whatever gun hand you hired." Mary didn't answer right away. She inhaled, then said, even and cold, "This town was never yours, and I'm not going anywhere." Hal snarled, "You think hiding behind a killer makes you untouchable?" That's when Calvin spoke. Low flat, like steel dragged across gravel. "I wasn't hired. I stay where I have reason." The first gunshot came from Hal's right. A man dropped from his saddle, blood spraying across his reins. Chaos erupted. Calvin moved like shadow. One shot. Then he vanished behind a water barrel, reloaded, fired again. Mary dropped to the ground, rolled, snatched her medical satchel, and pulled a civilian inside who'd been clipped by a stray round. Bullets tore through wood. Glass shattered. Bricks split. The brute went down with 2 shots to the shoulder. Another man took a bullet to the thigh and screamed, dragging himself into the saloon, blood marking his trail. Hal hadn't been hit yet. He dismounted and charged straight at Mary. She had just gotten to her feet when he slammed into her, throwing her into the doorway. The satchel flew from her hands. He roared, "You should have stayed quiet!" Mary didn't answer. She grabbed a steel spike she'd used to pin boards, swung it into his knee. He staggered, raised a hand to strike. But before he could, Calvin was there, like he'd risen from the ground itself. He tackled Hal, both men crashing down the steps. They fought like animals, no finesse, no rhythm. Fists, elbows, knees. Hal drew a knife and slashed Calvin's shoulder. Blood soaked through his shirt, but his eyes stayed locked. He punched Hal in the jaw, then the ribs. Hal scrambled, grabbed a fallen pistol. Mary saw it. She snatched a dropped revolver. Raised it, but Calvin had already fired. One shot, center mass. Hal dropped, dust rose, silence fell. Hal didn't move again. And only then did Elkhorn breathe. The morning after, Elkhorn lay in a silence that wasn't fear. It was exhaustion. The sun rose slow, as if cautious after a night stained by blood and gunpowder. Scorch marks still clung to porch beams. Spent shells scattered across doorsteps. The scent of smoke lingered on the breeze. But only one man had died, and the town knew that wasn't luck. Mary woke with a crude bandage wrapped around her left arm. She couldn't recall when she'd been hurt, only that her sleeve was soaked in blood from shoulder to wrist, and her notebook of patients had a torn corner where a bullet had split the edge of the desk. Calvin lay still on a cot in the back room, white gauze tight across his right shoulder. The gash had gone deep, but not fatal so long as it stayed clean. She knew that. Still, she stayed awake most of the night, counting his breaths. When he stirred, he said nothing. She handed him water. He caught her wrist gently. A promise without words. By noon, townsfolk began to knock on the clinic door. First came the baker's wife, with a loaf of dough still unbaked. Then the carpenter, carrying nails and old pine boards. Later, a few children appeared, not speaking, only offering a small paper sack of hard candy before vanishing again. No one spoke of the night before. No one asked who had fired first. But in their eyes, for the first time, there was no suspicion. Only something close to gratitude. No one asked Mary to leave anymore. No one questioned why she had stayed. That evening, she hung a small wooden sign outside the clinic. Painted each letter herself in thick black ink. Whitaker Medical Office. Simple. Clear, no permission asked. Elkhorn said nothing. But no one took it down. Calvin stood again after 3 days. He spoke little. Just quietly shaved, buckled his gun belt, and sat on the porch watching the dust roll across the road. Sometimes Mary found him wandering the herb garden, brushing his fingers through mint, sage, yarrow, as if knowing they were alive was enough. One morning, she stepped out back and saw him digging near the fence line. In his hands, a pine sapling barely to his knee. She raised an eyebrow. "What's that for?" He didn't look up. "A marker. For where we start again." She stood beside him, watching the dirt fold over roots, slow, careful, like he was planting something deeper than the tree. When he patted the soil down, she waited a moment before saying, "It's not much. But maybe it's enough." He didn't answer. But something near a smile touched the edge of his face, the kind rarer than peace out west. Time passed without making much sound. Elkhorn began to shift like autumn leaves quietly, unnoticed at first, but unmistakably. The blacksmith opened earlier. The general store added 2 shelves of salt and tobacco. The church hung its bell again, and the children started playing near the clinic without being pulled away. Mary said nothing about it. She still woke before the sunlight touched the window frame. Sleeves rolled before boiling water. Every vial, every needle, every pressure scale set with the precision of ritual. But unlike those early months, she no longer worked alone. A girl of 12, Clara May, began helping out. Daughter of the man who'd taken a stray bullet the night of the shooting. Quiet child, with sharp eyes and steady hands. Mary taught her to clean wounds, tell fever tea from worm tonic, and sterilize needles in ash water when the alcohol ran low. Each afternoon, Clara left with ink on her cuffs and a smile still forming on her face. Calvin still didn't talk much. But whenever Mary needed something lifted, it was already in place before she asked. In the evenings, he sat on the porch, disassembling his rifle or mending the saddle straps. Sometimes, Mary sat on the other side of the window, updating her ledgers. Both of them silent like words were no longer necessary between those who'd survived together. Once, as spring crept in, Mary asked softly, "How long do you think you'll stay?" Calvin was trimming dry branches. He didn't look up. "Depends on how long you want me to." She didn't answer. But that night, when she set down the dinner tray, there were 2 bowls instead of 1. By summer, the pine tree behind the house had grown taller than Mary. Birds began nesting on its lower limbs. Sometimes she stood beside it, palm resting against its trunk, eyes closed as if listening for something that couldn't be named. Not a vow, not regret. Just something only survivors, those who chose to stay, would understand. One afternoon, a stranger came through town. A young journalist from Helena, chasing stories of the woman who stood her ground in a gunfight. He sat in the cafe, notebook open, asking questions. But no one said much. When he finally asked the innkeeper, "What is she to this town?" The woman sipped her tea and replied quietly, "She didn't come here to be anything. But somehow, she became part of Elkhorn. 5 years after that blood-stained night, Elkhorn was almost unrecognizable. But no one found it strange. Change hadn't come with a gunshot or a telegram. It came through quiet mornings without fear, children laughing without being called back, and women no longer hidden behind curtains. The clinic had doubled in size, built with pine cut from the western forest. Mary was still the first to rise, the last to sleep. But now she had 2 apprentices, 3 shelves of medicine, and a grandfather clock gifted by the mayor, who once couldn't meet her gaze. Calvin had changed too. Gray threaded through his hair at the temples. The scar on his cheek had faded but never vanished. He no longer wore his gun every day, yet still cleaned each bullet as if the war had never truly ended. Those who once whispered "gunslinger" now nodded at him on the street. Some offered him tea. Others asked if he'd teach their sons to shoot arrows on weekends. But no one mentioned his past, and he never offered it. Mary never asked. But one evening, when their daughter, Clara, now 4, asked him about the scars on his hands, he didn't turn away. He held her close and told her that there were years when he thought all he could do was destroy, all he could do was run. Then one day, someone didn't ask him to stay, but left the door open when he chose not to leave. "And now," he said quietly, "I plant things instead of burying them." Mary stood on the porch that night, listening. She didn't interrupt. She understood. Forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's letting the past rest in the right place. Like a grave beneath a quiet tree. That pine tree now stood twice as tall as the house. When the wind moved through its branches, it made a sound like whispers from someone who'd once been lost in war, but had found their way home. Whenever strangers passed through, pilgrims, traveling healers, or widows with nowhere left to go, Mary offered them soup, a place to sleep. No names were asked if none were given, but if they stayed till morning, they often wandered out back, stood before the tree, and placed a hand on its trunk, as if something was there, not seen, not touched, but still deeply felt. Elkhorn was no longer a town for the strongest or the richest. It had become a place for those who stayed, and learned how to begin again, though no one ever taught them how. On an early autumn afternoon, when the fields behind the house had turned gold and the meadowlarks were beginning their journey south, Mary Whitaker stood beneath the old pine, her hand resting gently against its bark. The scent of sap blended into the wind-warm, honest grounding enough to make one forget that winter was still waiting on the horizon. The tree now reached nearly 3 stories tall, its roots sunk deep into soil that had once tasted gunpowder, blood, and the kind of silence no one ever explains. It was no longer just a marker of beginnings. It had become witness to a life chosen, not by chance, but by the quiet decisions that mattered most. To stay, to heal, and to love without needing ceremony. Behind Mary, the little house remained open. Inside, Calvin was slicing apples for Clara and her younger brother. On the table lay a hand-bound first aid guide that Mary had written, now printed, and used in 3 nearby towns. Clara could bandage scrapes, boil water for sterilizing, and read fever charts. She carried her mother's sharp gaze and her father's steady walk. Calvin was no longer the man who lived in shadow. He was the one who stood beside her in the light, never above, never behind. He still moved quietly, but his eyes no longer held stone. Some days, folks caught him picking up a dropped wooden toy, brushing off the dust, and handing it back without a word. They called him Mr. Avery now. No one spoke of what he'd done, because what mattered was what he did every day. He stayed. Elkhorn was still small. 1 clinic, 1 forge, 1 tired old saloon, but now it had a little library, an herb garden, a weekend class Mary taught where young mothers practiced taking pulses, and children learned to name their own bodies without shame. When strangers passed through dusty travelers seeking rest, young couples fleeing the cities, or widows who'd lost their way, they were often pointed toward the house with the green tin roof at the edge of town. And if they asked, "That woman, who is she?" someone would say, "Not just the doctor." Another might add, "Not just a wife or mother." And finally, an old man might shrug and smile, "She's the reason this town still breathes." When the wind moved through the hills now, it didn't carry screams. It didn't smell of gunfire. Only pine, only earth, and the memory of those who had every reason to vanish, but chose not to. Not everyone is remembered in stone. Not everyone has a song. But some are written into the land, and the land never forgets.